In July 1980, an incident on the porch behind me started a chain of events that a year later would result in a local resident being fatally shot in front of dozens of witnesses. Even though we don't know exactly who pulled the trigger that day, what we do know is this town's tragic answer to a situation they could no longer tolerate changed this town forever. This is the story of Skidmore, Missouri. First settled in 1840, the town was officially founded in 1880 by its namesake, Martin Skidmore, and covers less than half a square mile in northwest Missouri. By 1885, the town's business district had grown to 7 full blocks. In July of that year, a devastating fire destroyed the entire business district except the French and Company hardware store. The townspeople rebuilt. However, a second fire on the night of April 19, 1895, again destroyed many of the wood frame businesses. Still resilient, the town rebuilt again. By 1910, the town had grown to 53 full blocks and included an opera house, a hotel, 2 doctors, and 26 other businesses. 4 daily trains serviced the town, and 560 people called it home. By 1981, the population of Skidmore had dropped to 437. Still a farming community, the residents were self-sufficient, God-fearing, and resilient. They had also been terrorized by Ken McElroy for well over 2 decades. McElroy, known simply as Ken Rex to many in town, was born just outside Skidmore in 1934, one of 16 children born to poor migrant tenant farmers. He dropped out of school in the 8th grade and became known around town as a small-time thief, stealing everything from gasoline and grain to antiques. Gradually, his crimes would increase to include rape, arson, and attempted murder. Although arrested and indicted numerous times, he seldom was convicted. On the rare occasion he was convicted, he was often ordered to pay a small fine and released. Using intimidation, bribery, and violence to ensure that no witnesses would testify against him, he continued to inflict a reign of terror on this small town. Much has been written and documented about the specific incidents involving McElroy, so I won't cover them all here. However, in an effort to provide some context for why the people of Skidmore would feel so terrorized, I will profile some of the more serious. A thorough accounting of his criminal activities and the killing itself is covered in a book by Harry McLean titled In Broad Daylight. I've put a link in the description below in case you want to check that out. In 1974, McElroy was charged with the statutory rape of Trina McLeod, who had given birth to their child a year earlier when she was just 16. He was 40. A few days before his trial was to begin, Trina's family dog was found shot, and Trina's family home was burned to the ground. Her parents, who up until this point had refused to give consent for McElroy to marry her, consented to the marriage. This prevented Trina from testifying against him, and the charges were dropped. Later that same year, 14-year-old Alice Woods applied for public assistance, saying that McElroy had fathered her 2 children. This resulted in charges being filed against McElroy for molesting a minor. His solution was to move Alice and the children into his home with Trina and several other children by at least 2 different women. Why the molestation charges were dismissed is unclear. Alice would leave McElroy 2 years later. 2 years after this incident, in July 1976, McElroy shot Romaine Henry in an unprovoked attack. While working in his machine shed near his residence in Graham, Henry was told about gunshots coming from his nearby farm. When Henry was driving down the country road to the farm to check things out, he came upon McElroy standing in the road, looking like he wanted Henry to stop. When he did, McElroy came to the passenger side, opened the door, accused Henry of being around his place, and then opened fire, hitting Henry in the stomach. McElroy fired a second time, with this shot grazing Henry in the head. When 2 construction workers working at McElroy's home testified that they were with him at his home at the time of the shooting, even though their stories differed substantially, McElroy was acquitted. Through the years, McElroy would frequently brandish a gun, threaten to shoot any witnesses to his crimes, and stalk those he felt had wronged him in some way, sometimes sitting outside their home in his truck all night and firing a gun. McElroy wasn't a street fighter. Many who knew him have said that when he wanted revenge, he would shoot you, burn down your home, or steal your livestock. The beginning of the end began in July 1980 with the unprovoked shooting of 70-year-old grocer Ernest Bo Bowenkamp. The bad blood between the two apparently began when a grocery clerk at Bowenkamp's store asked one of McElroy's young children to put down some candy she hadn't paid for. In McElroy's mind, the clerk had accused his daughter of raiding the store. Several days after the incident in the store, McElroy found Bowenkamp on the loading dock of the store and opened fire. While seriously injured, Bowenkamp did survive his injuries. McElroy was charged with the shooting. Finally, the small town had a glimmer of hope that McElroy would be put where they felt he belonged, in prison. However, this was not to be. On the day of his conviction in June 1981, McElroy was released on a $40,000 bond pending an appeal. 4 days later, he went to the D&G Tavern carrying an M1 rifle with a bayonet on it. This resulted in the date of July 10, 1981, being set for a bond revocation hearing. On that hot July day, more than 60 men from the town gathered to attend the hearing, hoping their show of support would result in McElroy's bond being revoked and him being sent to jail. Unfortunately, in another frustrating turn of events for the small town, the hearing was postponed. The men then gathered at the Legion Hall. Some say the men discussed with the sheriff how to protect themselves from the town menace. Others claim the conversation centered around the killing of McElroy. In any event, at some point during the meeting, McElroy arrived in town with his young wife Trina, parked in front of the D&G Tavern, and went inside. The crowd of men left the Legion Hall and entered the tavern. When McElroy finished his beer and walked out, they did too. No one knows the mindset of these men. Perhaps their frustration with the justice system they felt had failed them was too much to bear. Perhaps years of frustration and anger at the antics of the town bully began to boil over. Perhaps they had just had enough. Who fired the fatal shots into the head and neck of McElroy is unclear. Officials have claimed that at least 2 gunmen shot McElroy while he was sitting in his truck with his wife in front of the tavern. Several men pulled his wife Trina out of the line of fire. She was uninjured. By the time law enforcement arrived, the streets were clear of any potential witnesses. A complete investigation of the shooting was undertaken by the local sheriff with assistance from the FBI. While several individuals were called to testify at the inquest, they all testified that while they heard the shots, they never saw anyone with a gun. Trina did identify who she claimed was one of the shooters. However, her story of the shooter standing by the driver's door and opening fire does not match the evidence found at the scene. To this day, who killed Ken McElroy remains a mystery. No charges were ever filed in this case. For those who feel justice was never served, I would suggest that the weight of carrying the secret of what happened that beautiful summer day in 1981, knowing you were taking the life of another, no matter how justified you might feel, is a heavy burden to bear for the hard-working Christian people of this small Missouri town. The population of Skidmore has now dwindled to 187. There is no longer a thriving business district. Main Street, for the most part, is boarded up. Ridding themselves of the town bully, as McElroy was often called, resulted in the town they tried so hard to protect becoming not much more than a wide spot in the road today. Was it worth it? Only those who were there that day can answer that. A year after the killing, McElroy's home burned to the ground. Bo Bowenkamp would live another 10 years, passing away in August 1991. He is buried alongside his wife Lois in Nottoway County. Trina McElroy left town shortly after the killing, remarried, and lived in the Lebanon, Missouri area until her death at the age of 55 in January 2012. As of the filming of this video, the former D&G Tavern sits abandoned, keeping the secret of what happened that fateful day locked securely inside.